Hello. This story is The Invalid and the Thief. So, there was an old man who was handicapped because of work. He worked very hard, and as a result, he ended up with several injuries that left him unable to walk normally and to enjoy the simple pleasure of going to the park and walking down a shady path without having prosthetic assistance, such as a cane and later a walker. Even that short walk, which was speckled with the pleasure of seeing a squirrel or climb up a tree and pretend that it's invisible, or watch the birds and listen to them, and just see the dappling of light that makes it through the leaves of trees on the ground below, interspersed with shooting, burning pain in his feet because of the bones grinding against each other. He was something of a loner, and although he called people friends, he didn't have a good tendency to maintain contact, nor did people often visit him for whatever reason. Some people just found him too intense. Some people felt uncomfortable because of his discomfort. Some people felt uncomfortable because in his aloneness, there was also loneliness, which caused him to talk and talk and talk and talk and say things that under normal circumstances he probably wouldn't have said if he had had enough social contact. But when you don't have enough social contact, as I've learned from meeting people with not enough social contact, including myself, when you finally have social contact, you want to just absorb as much as possible. And so you can be just a little bit too intense, or sometimes very much too intense when you're talking to another person, because you're so empty of that social contact, the consequent feeling of social happiness, that you just are afraid to go at a normal social pace, and you overwhelm people. We'll call this man Bill, in honor of one of my customers at the food pantry where I volunteer. And Bill lived, as I said, alone. And I am not referring to Bill, my customer. I'm just using that name in honor of him because I feel it's appropriate. So living alone, rarely visited by friends and family even, he spent far too much time alone, sitting, gaining weight, watching television, perhaps drinking a beer or some wine. Or maybe it was just chocolate milk. I don't know. I'll let you imagine for yourself what was his favorite beverage. For myself, my favorite beverage is water. I've got some right here. He would often peer out the window, not to be one of those neighborhood nanny grandparents looking for crime, because he lived in a nice neighborhood where crime was not an issue, but just because he was always hoping to see the mailman or a neighbor he knew, or sometimes anybody at all, so that he might possibly get to the door and get outside before they passed too far away from his voice. And then he would hope, of course, that they would choose to hear his voice and turn back and spend time with him. He wasn't a particularly good chef, so he couldn't just say, hey, I saw you walking by and I was just about to make lunch, and I thought, well, would you like to join me and we'll have a nice lunch together? Now, once upon a time when he was a younger man, he had done that with an underage person. And that underage person had mentioned it to their parents because they had gone into his house and they'd had a nice chat and had a nice meal, and that was it. Nothing untoward happened. But the parents didn't like that the man had invited their child into his home, even though his intentions were pure. He wasn't a pedophile. He wasn't a serial killer or anything else. He was just a regular person who was lonely and alone. And the father and the mother they had sat their child down and given them a stern but loving conversation in which they made it clear that going into another adult's home without telling them was potentially the last thing they would ever do in their life. And then the father had come to Bill's house. And again, this is not my customer I'm talking about. He had come to Bill's house and he had reamed him out 10 ways to Sunday. And Bill stood there in his doorway, not opening the screen door, because he had seen the angry face of this man. And initially during the conversation, he had attempted to apologize to the father, but the father was too enraged, too insensible to sense and compassion to do anything but scream at this poor man. And so Bill just stood there, arms trembling a bit as he held up his weight with his walker. Well, actually, probably wouldn't have been a walker at that point. So, for a good 15 minutes, this father raged and raged and raged at him, although he had done nothing wrong, and the father knew that quite well. Because the son had told him, or daughter, that nothing bad had happened. And in fact, the old man had given him a meal and had a wonderful conversation with him. Now, two things happened. That teenager developed a great deal of curiosity about the old man, but was terrified of the possibility of running afoul of his parents or her parents anymore. Anyways. And after that, stayed away from the old man. The other thing was that everybody in the neighborhood soon knew about the supposed whatever had happened to this poor teenager. So the teenager was marked as a victim, even though he protested to his friends that nothing had happened. They were like, sure. We understand. You don't want to talk about it. Rotten eggs would be thrown at the old man's house. Neighbors would not stop to talk to the old man. His reputation was destroyed just because he was lonely and shared a lunch with a teenager. And so it was that this man went from being alone and a bit lonely to very much alone and extremely lonely. Because now the only person that he could get to stop and talk to him was either the mailman, police, or total strangers who just happened to be walking through the neighborhood. None of his neighbors would come to visit him, not even the boy or girl that he had not wronged. Everyone became afraid, and he was persecuted, toilet papering his trees. Sometimes he would find poop on his lawn that was clearly not from a dog or cat. And other nastiness was performed to this man for doing nothing wrong, because the parents that had gone overboard, specifically the father, did nothing to dissuade their neighbors that this man had done nothing wrong. In fact, there was a bit of grim satisfaction. He learned his lesson. He'll never do that again. And surely they were right. Surely they were right. Eventually, this man Bill was so isolated that he would go out of his way to go outside of his community in which he was an outcast to find social interaction. The museum, the grocery store, the park, the food pantry, anywhere at all. As long as it wasn't too dangerous, because he knew he could not outrun somebody who wanted to accost him. And so he became known as a well-meaning but rather intense individual because of his loneliness. The people outside of his community did not understand why he was so lonely. It wasn't that he couldn't crack a joke. It wasn't that he couldn't converse. So they just assumed that it was because he was so intense. And so they tolerated him, and sometimes they would stop and talk to him, and sometimes they would try to pretend they hadn't seen him and go a different way. Tragic, really, that an innocent person who had done no wrong and had actually done something kind, because the parents of that teenager did not feed the teenager particularly well. And while, again, Bill was not a good cook, he had some good food in the fridge that he'd picked up and shared with this teen. Such is the way of humans. Over the years, the disability increased, the weight increased, the loneliness outpacing both of those. And when his car broke down and he didn't have the money to fix it, it sat in the driveway rusting and getting worse until finally one day he called the junkyard and got $100 for it. For a car that was worth several $1,000s. But junkers, they don't care. They'll take a car in any condition because they can get thousands of dollars out of the parts. And they don't have any compunction about ripping off an old lonely man or a young lady. They just look at the money. Right, so he used to mow his own lawn, but when it got to the point that if he continued to use the lawnmower to support him while he was mowing it, he was likely to end up becoming part of the lawn. And he thought that was probably not a good idea. Because although he was very saddened by the mistreatment of him by his neighbors, he still did not want to traumatize everybody by having a bloody patch of himself spread across the lawn. So he gave up on mowing his lawn, one of his few forms of exercise that he had left. And he would spend what little money he had to pay people to come in. But they would come in on riding mowers. You know, those fast kinds that go zoom, 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 and before you know it, they're gone. And he didn't have a particularly large yard. So he never really got much of a chance to talk to them because they'd always say after a couple of minutes of idle talk that, we're sorry, we have to go to the next customer now. Our boss pays us by the yard. And so they would leave. Bill would be unsatisfied, not with the lawn, which was perfect every time, but simply with the fact that he had not had enough interaction to heal his wounded heart. Sometimes at night, if you were to stand outside Bill's window, you would hear him lying in bed, sobbing, praying to God, or just cursing God. Saying that he just wanted people to talk to socialize with. But what could he do? Just walking hurt. He couldn't walk very fast or very far anymore. And people hated him for something he had not done. Poor Bill. So, on one particular night, it was a little bit different. Bill was in his bed, unable to sleep, miserable, physically and mentally, and he heard a noise, and he froze. Because when you're lying in the dark in bed and you hear a noise, you think, well, was that the house settling? Was it perhaps a branch falling on top of my roof? Or maybe was it an animal that had gotten in or under or inside their attic or roof or something like that? So he laid there as quiet as a mouse, probably quieter actually, and waited and waited and waited. And just as he was about to drop off into sleep from so much silence, in which his only thoughts were, I can't move or do anything lest I miss the next sound. Because it wasn't so much fearful as just making sure that it wasn't that he was going to have to set out mouse traps in the morning. Sorry. And then he heard another sound, and it was clear to him it was not a branch. And he waited a little bit longer, and he heard a footstep, and he knew that it wasn't an animal, at least not the wild type, in his house, and that there was somebody other than him in the house for whatever reason. Now, he did have things that were to a pawn shop, potentially somewhat valuable, but nothing incredibly valuable. He had a simple home. And most of the things he had were of more the sentimental type than of the type that were valuable. He didn't have a big collection of anything useful or valuable, or even a small one for that matter. His life had been lived simply because his income was simple, although he'd worked very hard for it. And you can imagine him however you like. He could have been black or white or Asian or Latin American or Southeast Asian, Polynesian, whatever. Mongolian, it doesn't matter. It's not about that. It's not about the person's religion either. So he very slowly and carefully and as quietly as he could, fortunately he didn't have a bed that was creaky, despite his excess weight. Got up to the point where he could grab his walker and quietly drag it over to closer a little bit, because it was right there next to his bed, so it wasn't very far to go at all. And he carefully and quietly levered himself out of bed and erected himself with the support of the walker. And then, since he never left his bedroom door closed, because why should he? There's nobody else. He calls out and he said, "Who's there?" There's no answer, of course. Because what intruder is going to be foolish enough to answer unless they're there to scare him? And so he drew a breath and let out a sigh of relief, because the person hadn't answered, which meant either that, most likely, to the intruder was not there to hurt him, unless, and this was the other possibility, the intruder was extremely sadistic and was going to make his life end in a very unpleasant, grotesque, and painful way. He said again, "Who's there? I heard you," in his biggest, gruffest voice, which he knew wasn't big or gruff anymore. So it really just came out kind of gaspy and weak. And there was silence. So he started to walk forward. He said, "I ask again, who's there? I don't mind that you're in my house, but I would like to know who my guest is. Or at the very least have confirmation that you are not some ghost." Still nothing. He said, "I am armed with my walker, and I walk as fast as, well, a tortoise. So I'm no threat to you. I can barely keep my body up on this walker. So if you're scared, please don't be scared. In fact, I invite you to talk to me." And he got into his living room and he sat down in his chair. He said, "I'll make you a deal. You come in here. You don't have to turn on the lights. You come in here and talk to me. And if you do that, I will not call the police. I will not report. They will not find your fingerprints. No one will know that you were ever in here." And he sat and he waited. And still nothing. Just silence. But he thought he heard a breath. So he said, "Okay, this is your last opportunity. I need you to either come in here and talk to me. We'll just have a pleasant conversation, hopefully. Unless, of course, you're a sadistic killer. Or you leave, I call the police, they get the fingerprints, and then you go to jail. I would much prefer you just come and talk to me. I'm not a threat. I don't have a weapon. And at the end of the conversation, as I have said, you will be able to leave freely. I will not report this incident." Finally, he heard a step. Another cautious step. He saw a head peering from around a doorway, probably looking to make sure there wasn't a rifle pointed at him. And sure enough, all he saw was an old man in a chair with a walker in front of him. The criminal, because of course when you enter somebody's house without their permission, you're a criminal. Doesn't matter if you're a cop or not. If you don't have permission to be there, you don't have a warrant, you're a criminal. Well, he stepped into the room. He went and sat as far away from the old man as he could. As soon as he sat, Bill said, "Hi, I'm Bill." "Are you a young man or a young woman or perhaps non-binary or something else? I just want to be polite to my house guest and respect your opinion of yourself." And he thought he heard a very quiet chuckle. And the answer doesn't even matter. But for the sake of the story, we'll just say that it was a male. Because the majority of intruders into houses are male. So again, I'm Bill. If you'd like to introduce yourself now or at some point in this conversation, you're welcome to do so. If you don't want to, I understand. You're obviously going to be apprehensive about revealing your identity because, well, you know, the circumstances under which you entered my home. And this time he definitely heard a chuckle. So he could tell that the thief, whoever he was relaxed. And so he talked, asking simple questions of the thief. "How are you?" "I'm okay. This is an unexpected turn of events, and I'm glad you weren't pointing a gun at me. I'm not quite prepared to die anytime soon." And eventually the thief started asking questions back. And once Bill felt that enough of a rapport had been established, because under normal circumstances, as I have explained already, Bill would be all over this interaction and just smothering the person in attention. This was a special situation. Here was somebody in his house who he had not invited, who represented a question mark as far as intent and the possibility of an abrupt and maybe painful death. So he wanted to make sure that he did not misstep and cause the worst to happen. It was like you are in the forest and you see a deer and then you stop moving because you want to watch the deer. The deer turns its head toward you, swiveling its ears about like this, and then goes back to grazing as you remain quiet. But the moment you get in a position that's close enough and you step on a branch and it cracks, the deer bounds away. So Bill was looking at it kind of like that situation, except the deer had gigantic antlers that could have impaled him. So the conversation went on, and as the time passed, the invader became more relaxed and more communicative, and Bill became more communicative. And Bill realized that here was a person who was down on his luck. He realized that this person wasn't a criminal by choice, but more because of necessity. Now, that's we're splitting hairs, but when somebody robs for legitimate necessity, such as feeding their family, not losing their home, and so on, that's rather different than a career criminal who continues to rob well after they no longer need what they're getting, let alone those who do it with malevolent intent. And despite himself, Bill came to feel something of a kinship with this individual whom he still didn't know. So the story goes on and on. conversation, that is. And after quite some time, the intruder says, I need to go soon. And Bill said, I understand. You don't want to be seen exiting my house through a door or a window when the sun is up. But I have a proposition for you. If you are willing, come back every week. Not through the window. You can come to the front door or to the back, ring the bell, and visit with me for as long as you have time for. In return for that simple courtesy, I offer you conversation, and if you'd like, I'll make sure that there's a beer or a bottle of wine or a meal that you can enjoy. I'm not a good cook, but I know how to go to the grocery store. And the intruder laughed. But if you do return, I will have to insist that you tell me your name, because it's very odd for me to just keep on referring to you as you. I would like to be able to call you by name. If you want to give me a fake name, that's okay. But at some point, down the road, it would be nice if you tell me your real name. First, if not last. And the criminal sat quietly for a while and said, okay. But how will you know it's me? Bill laughed in a sort of a sad, self-deprecating way. Oh, trust me. The only people who come to my door anymore are the mailman and the people who cut my lawn. And occasionally somebody who delivers groceries for me. Oh. I'm sorry. I see. So, he said, I'll take you up on that offer. I don't know when the next time is that I'll be able to stop by, but I'll stop by during daylight, and I'll probably go to the back door, but I don't know. We'll see. I'll have to evaluate the situation. And he said, now, you'll have to pardon me, Bill. It's time for me to go. Do you mind if I leave by the back door? And Bill said, no, not at all. I'd rather you do that than potentially hurt yourself getting out a window. Which Bill didn't realize it, but the thief was touched by that, although he was uncertain as to whether Bill was sincere or not. So the man left. Bill sat there for quite some time, a feeling of bittersweet happiness in his heart, for he finally had somebody to talk to, but he couldn't call that person a friend. And yet, it was something. After all those years of isolation, it was something important to Bill. Sometimes desperation outweighs other considerations. So, a week passed. On the second week, Bill heard his doorbell ring. But by the time he got there, there was nobody at his door because he had been in the bathroom. And, it's quite a trial getting off the toilet into your door, even if the door is just 20 feet away, when you are handicapped, like Bill. He still moved faster than he normally moved, but he was too late, and he didn't see anybody outside. So he decided next time he would yell as loud as he possibly could, which was no longer very loud at all, to try and alert the person at the door that he was coming. The next day, the doorbell rang, and he was not on the toilet. And there was an unidentified male outside his back door. And he knew it just at that moment when he saw him at the back door, not the front, that it was his uninvited guest, who but now invited. So Bill yelled as loud as he could, said, "I'm coming! I'm coming, just a minute!" He got to the door, and happily the man was still standing there. And I'll allow you to carry on with how you have identified this person. The hair, the eyes, the skin color, the clothes, the whole thing. It's up to you. So Bill let him in, and they sat down and they chatted for about an hour before the man left again through the back door. And then a week or so passed, and the man showed up again. And again. And it started to feel like there was something more than the intruder/visitor between them developing. And months passed. Visits became sometimes twice a week. And one day, when he opened the door for this stranger/visitor, the man held out his hand and said, "I'm Georgie." And Bill looked at him. It was as if he knew that he should know something, but he couldn't figure out what it was. And he very gladly shook hands. He said, "Georgie, it's very nice to finally meet you." And there was this odd look on Georgie's face, but he smiled and laughed a little and said, "Likewise." So they sat down, and Georgie stayed longer than he ever had stayed before. They had a wonderful conversation on many topics, some of which Georgie knew a lot about, some of which Bill knew a lot about, some of which they actually both knew a fair amount about, and they found great joy in being able to compare notes and to agree and even disagree on those topics that they both knew about. Each taught the other things. And eventually, a year later or so, Georgie had arrived and he said, "Bill, I have a question for you." And Bill was like, "Well, you can ask me anything, Georgie. I've never held back." And Georgie said, "That's true. But this is a little bit different." And Bill had all of his attention focused on Georgie at that point. He said, "Okay, Georgie, what is it?" "I'd like to bring my family to meet you, but they don't know how we met about that night when I was here uninvited. And I'd appreciate it if we could keep it that way." And Bill said, "I have no idea what you're talking about, Georgie. You're my dear friend, and you've always been invited." And Georgie said, "Thank you, Bill. That means a lot to me." And so Bill was a bit excited. He said, "Do I need to get some food? Do I need to have a game available, or what should I do? And because he hadn't even seen children except for from a distance for a very long time. And Georgie smiled at him and said, "Thank you, Bill. You're a good man, but no. My kids have heard a lot about you, and they're very curious to meet you. And well, perhaps I should tell you that their grandfather, he passed away, and I think they really miss him, and I think they might take to you, if you don't mind." And Bill, his heart was overflowing. Here I am telling a fictional story, and I'm trying not to cry. And he said, "Georgie, that is the nicest thing anybody has ever said to me in my entire life. Of course, bring your family. Please. But just let me know when, so that I can at least try to hobble around and clean up." And Georgie had to laugh because Bill didn't have much busy time in his life, and so one of the things he did was make sure his house was always clean. And Bill laughed with him, and they had another wonderful conversation, and they set the date at which point the family would come to visit. And they arrived on that date, not at the back door, as Georgie had always done, but at the front door. Wife, 2 children. Bill had a smile from ear to ear. He invited them all in. He had cleaned so well that you could have eaten off of any part of the house. And perhaps unsurprisingly, over the couple, 3 years of their friendship, Bill had lost weight. Something had changed through those regular interactions that had caused Bill not to feel so lonely, that he was not so hungry. So he ate less, and as a consequence of eating less, he weighed less. And he was looking better and feeling better. His feet were feeling better. His knees, his ankles, his hips, his back. As the weight melted away, some of the pain did too. He was dressed in what he felt was his Sunday best, although he wasn't a churchgoer or anything goer. It's hard to go somewhere when it's hard to just walk. And he invited them in. They sat down. And mostly Georgie just sat and watched after the introductions were done, while his wife and his 2 children peppered Bill with questions. The kids took to Bill right away because, honestly, when he wasn't overwhelming people with his loneliness, his need for interaction, he really was quite a pleasant person to be around. And Bill could see that although the family was doing okay, Bill knew that Georgie was no longer a thief by necessity. He could see they were not well off either. And he was so delighted to have them all in his house. And this became a regular thing where they would come and visit Bill. And the children would treat him like their grandfather. Bill's heart was full. Every time they visited was a joy to him. And from that point on, things got better. One day, Georgie arrived alone. Bill was a little bit disappointed because he always loved seeing Georgie's wife, Annette, and the two kids, Frankie and Allie. And Georgie sat down and he was all serious. And Bill said, "What's wrong? Are your kids okay?" He said, "Yes." "Is your wife okay?" He said, "Yes." "So if it's not Annette, Frankie, and Allie, why do you look so serious?" He said, "Bill, I'm so sorry, Bill. I'm so sorry for all those years of loneliness and pain that were inflicted on you." And he said, "Georgie, it's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." And he said, "Yes, I did. Yes, Bill, I did." And Bill was so confused. "What are you talking about, Georgie? You have been a saving grace for me. You have taken me from the doldrums of insanity and loneliness and brought me joy and happiness and companionship. My life would be a wasteland of grayness and sand without you and your family." And Georgie said, "I know, but it's my fault. Please, Georgie, I don't understand. Why are you blaming yourself?" And Georgie said, "Because, do you remember how it all started? Remember the story you told me about the father who came over and yelled at you, and how all your neighbors started to shun you, all because of some kid you let in your house and had a meal with? That was me. I'm sorry, Bill. I'm so sorry. I was scared. I didn't have the courage to stand up to my parents. I didn't have the courage to stand up to my friends. I didn't have the courage to tell anybody to stop, that nothing bad had happened and nothing bad would happen. And I didn't have the courage to come and visit you again until that night, those years ago, when I came in your house uninvited." And Bill just sat there, his mouth hanging open, not knowing what to say. So Georgie said, "So if you want to yell at me, please yell at me. I deserve it. If you want to hate me, if you don't want to see me again, I understand. I accept whatever punishment you want to give me. I am so truly penitently sorry, Bill." And still, Bill said nothing. He just sat there staring with his mouth open, barely breathing, trying hard to comprehend what he had just heard, that here was the kid who had been at the crux of his misery all those years. Georgie had tears streaming down his face as he slowly got up like a defeated man and started to walk toward the door, the front door. And just as he was reaching for the doorknob, Bill called out, "Wait, Georgie." Georgie turned, not knowing what was going to happen next. And Bill said, "Sit down." So Georgie did. "May I ask you a question, Georgie?" And he said, of course. I'll tell you anything. When you were here that first night, were you here to steal from me? And Georgie paused, and then he said, no. I lied to you. Not that I had not been a thief, but that I had been in your house to thieve from you. I was checking on you. It wasn't the first time I had done it. I've had so much guilt since that day when I was a teenager and I didn't speak up, that I came to check on you from time to time in the middle of the night when I felt it was safe to do so without you knowing, without my family knowing, without my neighbors knowing. So Bill sat up straighter in his chair and he said, so you're telling me you entered my house on multiple occasions for the purpose of verifying that I was okay? And Georgie hung his head in shame and he said, yes. And on none of those occasions did you make any attempt to let me know that this was what you were doing. You did not communicate with me directly or indirectly. No. And you never took anything out of my home. Yes and no. What do you mean, yes and no? I left with both sadness and happiness. Because every time I came, I wanted to speak to you, but I was too much of a coward. I left with the sadness knowing that once again I had failed to do that. But the happiness to know that you were okay. Okay? Okay? Oh, Georgie. I was not okay. I was dying. I was a walking dead man. My life had become nothing. I was so desperate for human contact because of all the years of isolation, the years of shunning, the years of being ostracized for something I had not done. Georgie said, I'm sorry. Bill, I'm so sorry. Bill slumped back in his chair, exhausted physically and emotionally, trembling all over. He closed his eyes, and he could hear Georgie starting to get up. He said, don't. Just stay there. And he sat there just breathing, calming himself down, just listening to his breathing, to separating himself from the emotions swirling through him, the pain and the anger, the sadness, the feeling of betrayal, everything. Because here was somebody who was a dear friend confessing to him about a crime he had committed, not of a crime of violence or passion, but a crime of omission, of denial, of failure, of cowardice. He had exposed himself at his weakest to Bill. And at some level, Bill realized this, and he realized that striking out at Georgie was not the thing to do. So he sat there 5, 10, 15, 20, 30, And one time, Georgie started to get up again, and Bill said, "Don't. Please stay." So Georgie sat, and he didn't try to leave again. Finally, after a very, very long time, Bill opened his eyes, and he said, "Georgie, what you did was wrong. Your failure to speak up hurt me in so many ways. Your failure to speak up when you were a teenager, your failure to have the bravery to speak to me at any point during those nightly visits kept me isolated and miserable. And I wonder if we would be having this conversation now if I had not initiated it." And Georgie hung his head as low as it could possibly go, and he said, "I don't know. But Georgie, you were a kid. Just a confused, somewhat lonely, somewhat awkward 15-year-old. And I was a very lonely old man even then. I can't blame you for not speaking up. It is so easy as a teenager to not know the right thing to do, to not do the right thing when you know it. There's so many pressures put upon us that make us feel like we can't do the thing we want to do, the thing that is right. So yes, you were wrong, but I understand and I forgive you for that." And Georgie said, "But that doesn't forgive me for all those nightly visits of silence." And Bill said, "No, it doesn't. But at least you cared enough to make sure I was still alive. At least you took the time, as stealthily as it was, to check on me. Nobody, not a police officer, not a mailman, nobody has ever done that for me other than you." Georgie said, "What about your kids?" "My kids? They are strangers to me. You know that, Georgie. So, I forgive you." And Georgie looked up at him, and there was something so vulnerable in Georgie's face that Bill felt compelled to continue to speak. And he said, "I forgive you for all of the real and imagined mistakes you made regarding me, because you have been also punishing yourself all these years. But you have also, through your companionship and your family, brought me great joy. You have made me a whole man again. Have you not noticed how much weight I've lost? Do you not remember what a sack of lard I used to be? Did you not notice that I moved to the door faster than I used to?" And Georgie said, "I do notice those things, Bill, and it makes me happy." So see, yes, you screwed up. And now I forgive you. Thank you. Thank you, Bill. Thank you so much. And Bill pulled himself up out of the chair faster than he used to. And he hobbled over to Georgie faster than he used to. And he took his hand and he said, "No, Georgie. Thank you." Now, if you don't mind, Georgie, I am exhausted. I need to go lie down. If you can see your way out and come and see me again with your family when you're ready, I'd appreciate that. I really need to lay down. So he laid down. Georgie saw himself out. The visits continued. And then one day, Georgie and his family arrived. Bill didn't answer the door. They knocked and knocked and knocked. Rang the doorbell, pounded on the door. Some of the neighbors were looking over. Of course, by that time, they knew very well about Bill's regular visitors. Some of them looked askance at them for visiting the strange old man who had once supposedly molested a 15-year-old boy, who had skeletons buried in the basement and was a monster, although he was not, and did not, and had not. Georgie just turned his head away from those people, and he said, "I'm going to look through the windows." But really what he was going to do was he was going to let himself in, because he knew how to do that, of course. So he disappeared around the side of the building, looking in windows, and when he got to the back of the house, he let himself in. He found Bill laying in his bed. He looked very pale, and Georgie couldn't tell if he was moving. So he called out softly to Bill, but Bill didn't wake up. He put his hand on Bill's arm and shook it, but he knew immediately it was too late. Bill was cold. Not cold because of the temperature of the room, but cold, as in cold, dead cold. His heart skipped a beat, and he had to stifle a cry. He quickly exited the way he had come in, ran around the building. He said, "Call 911, call 911. I can see he's not moving." So somebody called 911, and somebody else called 911 instinctively, because even though they hated the man who had never done anything wrong to them, they also knew it was the right thing to do. At least they could do that, though they got everything else wrong. The ambulance arrived in record time. They got into the house and removed Bill under a sheet. He wasn't nearly as heavy as he would have been if he had died before Georgie saved him inadvertently. So it wasn't a huge struggle to get his corpse out. Apparently, Bill had set up for himself many years ago a means of disposal of his body. Unfortunately, because he had been lying dead too long, they couldn't use his organ donation requests. Although he had not sat so long that the brain donation program could not harvest his brain to use it for their research. And that's a real thing, by the way. There is an organization that does take brain donations. And a few weeks passed, and Georgie was at work, and Annette had just gotten home. The kids weren't home yet. And she gets a phone call on their house phone because they were a little bit old-fashioned and still had a house phone. And said, may I speak to Georgie or Annette? And she said, I'm Annette. Well, what can I do for you? If you're here to sell something, I'm not interested. Take me off the list. No. Please don't hang up. It's not about that at all. I'm a lawyer. And I'm handling the last will and testament of Bill. And Annette stopped breathing. Go on. He was a dear old friend. So it turns out that Bill didn't have any close connections with his remaining family, didn't have a spouse, and named you and your husband and your kids as his benefactors. And Ned sat down very, very abruptly and said, what? Yeah, Bill left everything to you guys. And I just need to go through the paperwork and everything and turn over the keys to the house for you and everything else and let you know what you've got. And she said, excuse me, I'm sorry. He said, yes. He said, well, that your kids were his grandkids. And Annette laughed while she cried. And she said, yes, of course. He was their kind of adopted grandfather. And the lawyer said, Bill was a good man. I knew him. I didn't have a lot of interaction with him. I'm so busy, so many clients. But what little interaction I did have with him, especially in his later years, was quite pleasant. He used to be a very lonely man, and something changed. And I guess that must have been you and your family. And Annette says, I suppose so. It certainly wasn't his neighbors. And so it came to be that Georgie and Annette, who had been living in apartments and trailer homes for most of their marriage, came into a house. A small but comfortable house, big enough for four, with a tidy yard that was large enough for the children to enjoy. And eventually, Georgie found his nerve. And he told all the neighbors, one by one, those who were still alive anyways, but he told every neighbor the truth about Bill, about him, about that day. And two things happened. Every one of those neighbors, with the exception of one or two people who had no sense of decency, felt shame. Shame for having wronged somebody who had never done them wrong and had never done Georgie wrong. Shame for having shunned somebody who was so lonely for all those years. They went to his memorial. They left flowers. They left candy, which the animals ate and got sick from. The candy, not the flowers. And strangely, somehow, very, very strangely, Georgie's actions had the effect of healing the community, of releasing everyone from the suspicion. Not that there's no reason for suspicion, but the suspicion that had fractured the community for all those years. Brought everyone together. They started to have community events, block parties, potluck dinners at Bill's house during good days outside, and on bad days in larger houses of other people's. And every single event was in honor of Bill. Not Georgie, not Annette. But they felt great pride for their departed friend. Eventually, in the nearby park, a memorial was put up for Bill there. And it was a statue of Bill in his better years with a walker, surrounded by Georgie, Annette, Frankie, and Allie, or Alicia. With a plaque reminding everyone of the story, of the shame, and the healing, of the responsibility we have for our neighbors, to seek out the truth, to be just in our actions, and not be too over hasty in believing gossip. That memorial served that community for a very, very, very long time. Long after Frankie and Allie were dead. And of course Annette and Georgie. Thank you so much for listening to my story. And I hope you have a great day.